Okay, so this video we're going to be looking at business culture. In particular, we're going to be looking at what is culture, different models that help us to identify what culture might actually look like within organisations, look at the different levels of culture within organisations, and then also thinking about how culture actually enables a company to operate more efficiently and adds value to that organisation. So, at a very basic, trying to think about what is culture in an organisational context, and it's really about the way things are done within an organisation. It's kind of like describing its atmosphere. Um, the situation where you just know how to do things because that's how you do it. You know where to sit. You know what the routines are and what the procedures are. So, for example, my organisation, at the end of term, we usually always go for bacon rolls and coffee in the morning, and that's just become part of our culture because it's a shared understanding of the way we do things and how we react and what we do as we're approaching our summer holidays, for example. But the culture is wrapped up with lots of things. Some things you can see, so there can be quite tangible things that are policies and procedures and corporate culture and the logo and things like that are all part of the culture, but there's also a lot of things that we just take for granted that we don't actually think about that are also part of organisational culture. And sometimes it can be depicted as an iceberg where you're actually only seeing like 10% of the iceberg, the rest of it's all hidden. So culture can be the same, and that's why it makes it very difficult to define, because it's difficult to define something that you can't see, you can't touch, but we just know it's there, and that is what makes a culture of an organisation. So thinking about that, it's really important because you have to be able to fit in with the organisation, and if you are part of the organisation and you're getting involved in those different rituals and different behaviours and the stories that they tell within the organisation, it's all part of the identity and you want to be part of that. So a lot of times when companies are recruiting, they want people that are going to fit in with the culture that's already there. And as I have in the slide, if you have everybody that's all part of that culture and buys into it, and they're all working together because they have this sense of identity, it means that they will perform better, the organisation will perform better, but the individuals within the organisation will be performing better, and generally speaking it should be more efficient. And because of that, because of the harmony created by the culture within the organisation, it can add value and it can give the organisation competitive advantage over the competition, which ultimately is what an organisation wants. They want to be better than the competition. They want to get to market first. They want to have better staff that allows them to perform better. So key characteristics when we're thinking about culture, there's lots of different terminology that we can apply to it. It's obviously, as I say, you join an organisation and things can seem quite strange to you, but to other people it's just how they've always done that. Whatever it is, that's just how they do things. So culture is something that we learn. We learn through observing, we learn through copying the people that are already there, and we learn those habits and that way of doing things. it's something that's shared. So it's part of a lived experience that each of the members of that community within the organisation, it's something that they're all sharing and they're all part of. And it's ongoing, it's continuous, it's symbolic, and there can be some rituals that take place within an organisation's culture that can be part of the symbols of the organisation. As I said, a throwaway example of myself and my colleagues going for coffee and bacon rolls can be seen as a symbol, and it then becomes integrated. It becomes part of how we do things, what we are, and as you learn and start sharing and start being part of this and you participating, you're becoming integrated as well. And it'll be adaptive, it'll adapt to what's going on round about. It's not something that's necessarily going to be static. It will adapt, it will change. People leave an organisation, new people come in, situations change, habits change. The chances are that although organisations will have a formal culture, which we'll talk about later on, there will also be informal cultures within organisations as well. And I'm just thinking that something like COVID, which has had such a massive impact on every workplace in the world, probably, the chances are that for those organisations where people have been working remotely for a great part of the past year, when they do return to the workplace, the cultures, the learned behaviours, the symbolic gestures that take place, these things might change. And although some of the learned behaviours, the shared experiences that are all tying everybody together will still be there, the chances are that the culture might change. It may be adapting to cope with the new realities, to cope with how people want to live and work going forward. It may not be the same, so the culture may change going forward as well. Obviously, for something like, if culture is built on learned behaviours, for example, then it's something that's got to be repeated. It's a regular occurrence. It's not something that just happens once a year or twice a year. It's something that's become part of the regular day-to-day activities within the organisation, and that's where the norms come in. It's the normal way of behaving, the normal way of doing things within that organisation. So it's just, you don't think about it, it's just that's how we do things, that's what we do. And again, there will be shared values within the organisation, whether it's quality in education, being leading edge in your sector, whatever it is, those dominant values, for that to be embedded into the culture, has to be shared by everybody that's part of that organisation. And it's part of their philosophy, it's part of their what they stand for, what they think is important. There will be rules. As I say, you've got your policies and procedures and things like that as well. But within culture sometimes as well, some of the rules can be unwritten about what the rest of the group will consider to be acceptable behaviour as well. And then organisational climate can be things like, we describe sometimes companies as being a good company to work for or a bad company to work for, that they've got a reputation for being supportive, being a fun place to work, or at the other end, they've got a reputation for being very controlling, for being really horrible to their employees, for having a bullying culture. That's your organisational climate, what it's like to actually work there. All of these things all contribute, all combine to create the culture within an organisation. So you can see it's not that straightforward. There are lots of different things that all combine to create a culture within an organisation. So the first model that I want to talk about is Sheen's model. And basically he says that there are three parts to how we define culture. And the idea of the iceberg has come from Sheen. And basically he's saying that you've got three elements: the artifacts, the values and norms, and taken for granted assumptions. And according to Sheen, only the artifacts are above the water if we think about it in terms of the iceberg. So artifacts are things we can see. They're the tangibles, the company uniform, the company logo, any mission statement from the company, policies and procedures, corporate colours, the buildings, all these different things that we can actually see. So with, as I say, in an educational environment, the timetables, the organisational charts, the way the library is structured, all of these different things, the fact that you would expect to find a library or a learning resource centre in an educational establishment, these are artifacts. The values are the things we believe in, the things that are at the heart of the organisation. So for some companies that are against animal testing, or support fair trade and coffee production and the growing of fruit and vegetables and things like that, fair trade, ethical trading, all of these things can be considered to be values. So it's the things that are at the heart of the organisation, the things that are most important to that organisation, to that company. So again, for educational establishments, it could be delivering quality learning, making sure that learning's reaching the majority of the population and it's not being exclusive. All of these things could be classified as being values. Taken for granted assumptions are exactly what they say. They are the assumptions that we make that we don't think about. It's just we've done these things, or that's been the behaviour and it's been the way of doing things for such a long time that it's almost become second nature. You do it without thinking. But it can be assumptions that you would make about a particular company. So if I were to mention particular company names to you, you might have ideas about what you expect in terms of the brand. What does that brand mean to you? What kind of image does it portray? If I say something like Apple to you, what does that mean to you? Does it mean high-end, well-researched products, quality, leading edge? All of these things are taken for granted assumptions that we just assume that that's what that's going to mean, that that's what we're going to get from that brand, from that company. And the employees will have assumptions as well. Again, usually if I'm covering this in class, I would be talking to my students about what their assumptions are as students. And it would be things like an assumption that you can go to the LRC and you will be able to access computers, that you will get support from your lecturers, that you will get the assistance that you need if you are struggling. All of these things are taken for granted assumptions. So, as I said, got a bit more detail, but really just going through what I've said. The artifacts are the physical, tangible things that we can see within an organisation, but they are also, as the last bullet point says, the ceremonies and rituals that take place within an organisation. As I said, with the college, it could be graduation ceremonies. With other organisations, it could be awards dinners. If it's a sales environment, for example, and you have salesperson of the year type awards or something like that. Anything like that at all would be ceremonies and rituals. So values and norms, as I said, they're beliefs, or it's the core fundamental things that are at the heart of the organisation, what's most important to them. And the assumptions are things that we do or behave that are so embedded that we don't even think about it, we don't question them. So there can be some things, as it says here, there can be links to artifacts and to values. So they maybe start off as being explicit. Something is written down, but sometimes it can be taken from something that's been written down and be developed in just through people talking to each other and sharing what they think that means, and the assumptions then get built out of that other people then start to behave in the same way because it's become an assumption. So moving on from looking at Sheen's 3 elements, the artifacts, the values and the assumptions, I want to look in a little bit more detail at different cultural models that look at what different cultures might look like within organisations. So depending on maybe the sector an organisation is working in, or the type of products they're trying to do, or maybe a market that a company is trying to get into, they may look at different cultural models and pick a model that's going to be most appropriate for their organisation. Or it could be that we look at a model and it helps us to identify what's actually going on within an organisation. So there are different models we're going to look at. Handy is probably one of the most common, one of the most popular. And the one we're going to look at with Handy is looking at Greek gods as the foundation to his model. Then we'll briefly look at Dale and Kennedy, and lastly we'll look at Hofstede, because he is also looking at international cultures and how cultures in companies in different countries, the culture can be different as well. So the culture in Britain may be in some respects similar to culture in America, but there will be differences between culture in Britain and culture in Europe, or with culture in Japan, for example. So Hofstede is more concerned with the international dimension when we're looking at culture. So we're going to be looking at all of these in a little bit of detail. So Handy, as I said, we have the gods of management, and he is looking at 4 Greek gods: Zeus, Athena, Apollo and Dionysus. So with each of these, usually if you go off and do your own research, you will find that there are images that are used to depict each of these gods. But basically we have also, as you can see, terms that describe what's going on within each of the different cultures. So a power culture, task, role and people. So with Zeus, it's usually depicted as a spider's web, and the idea is that you have one person at the heart of the organisation that has their hands on the pulse and is aware of what's going on everywhere. So they're controlling everything. So it's probably a smaller organisation, possibly family run, where you've got one person at the heart of the organisation who is controlling everything and holds all the power. Athena is looking at a task culture. So it's usually depicted as a matrix. And those of you that are familiar with organisational structures, you're really looking at a matrix type structure. The focus within an Athena culture would be on working in teams, recognising that you're bringing together teams where people have specialist expertise, specialist knowledge, and that's all coming together to form a task culture. So they're more focused on the task and bringing together the expertise, and there's not really any kind of hierarchical control or anything like that. So it's much more fluid, much more flexible. And as I say, if we look at the organisational structures, it's linking in with a matrix structure. Apollo's role culture is usually depicted as a Greek temple, and it is your usual hierarchical structured organisation, more like a big bureaucratic organisation, councils, public sector, big organisations that need the structure, they need the rigidity that comes with that. And the focus is much more on the roles, the jobs that are being allocated to people. So again, that's why the hierarchy is more important. And you've got, if you think about your Greek temple, you've got your management team are in the roof, the bit at the top, above the columns, and then the columns each depict different departments within the organisation, and the role would be where you sit on the hierarchy is going to be controlled by policies and procedures, rules and regulations. So it's going to be quite structured, quite regulated as well. It's going to take more time to do things because of the bureaucratic nature of the structure as well. Diagnosis, or the people-person culture, is totally opposite to those we've looked at before. You may have a group of people coming together, maybe like a group of consultants all setting up in partnership together, or a partnership of a professional firm, lawyers, accountants, something like that, where they will come together and they may pool support services, but each person is going to be concerned with their own agenda. They're working together and collaborating where they have common interests, but even as an organisation, each of the partners, if you like, within that organisation are really concerned for their own interests, and they're just looking out for themselves in this one. So hopefully that has been helpful. Moving on to Dale and Kennedy, they looked at culture slightly different, and they were thinking about, as it says here, risk-taking, individual and collective behaviour, and habits formed by people. So we're looking at different cultures within organisations. Again, we're not looking at individual culture. This is about culture within businesses. So, some companies where it's quite a tough guy, quite a macho culture, macho image for the organisation, as opposed to perhaps more work hard, play hard. So that might be something like marketing or advertising or something, where the stock market, where it's okay to, put in all those additional hours, and, potentially they could have burnout, but they will party hard as well. Bet your company culture is more risk taking. They're willing to take risks, and they will be willing to do that, and willing to compromise to some extent as well, and take those risks, as opposed to the process culture, which is more going to be focused on following the rules and regulations. Okay, so a very brief overview of Dale and Kennedy. And then if we move on to Hofstede, as I said, he's more concerned with looking at how culture is shaped depending on which country people come from. And there have been studies done to look at what happens and how people behave and interact in different situations. But he breaks it down into these 5 dimensions of national culture, as are called here. So you're looking at the culture and you're trying to assess in any country, in any organisation, what is the power or distance between people within the organisation. So, for example, in Britain and in America, the power distance is quite close. There's not a lot of distance between people. Think about personal space. Different cultures, the amount of personal space that someone needs can vary, and it also varies between men and women. But that's the same kind of idea. But it's also an example. When I was at university, I spent a year working in France, and most of the time, most of my working life in the UK, I have been first name terms with everybody, from senior partners right down to the office junior. Everybody was on first name terms. It was very unusual to get someone who you addressed them by their family name, their surname. But when I went to France and I was working in France, it was very different. It was much more formal. There was more distance between staff and management. You did address people by their second name. You didn't use first name terms at all. It was very different. Uncertainty avoidance is about how much risk you're going to take to some extent. Do you like to not know what's going to happen, and are you going to cope with ambiguity? How well do you cope with ambiguity? How well does your culture cope with ambiguity? Do you like everything ordered and regimented and you know exactly what's happening all the time? Or can you cope with not knowing sometimes? Individualism and collectivism, again, is quite an easy one to identify. It's down to how much within an organisation is it focused on the individual, on me. And generally speaking, America, Britain, we tend to have quite an individualist focus. In Europe, it's much more collective, and somewhere like Japan and Asia, that collectivism is really, really significant and really important again. So there can be differences in terms of how people work. And if you're working on an international stage, then sometimes these things can be quite important. But it also helps us to understand perhaps different behaviours when we have foreign nationals working in the same organisation alongside us. Masculinity and femininity can be, the language that's used can be how things are done within the organisations again. So you're looking at different ways of doing things, whether there's more support offered, whether you're just expected to hide your emotions and get on with your job. And the final one, does the organisation, and again, as I say, because these are national cultures, it's about the attitude across business within the country, not just individual businesses. So is it a long-term orientation or is it a short-term orientation? Are you, do you look short-term? And in the UK, there's a lot of criticism of business for being very short-term focused. They're focused on profits, are not focused on long-term goals, are not focused on long-term benefits. They're more interested in short-term gains. So those sorts of things again would be an indicator of different types of national cultures. As I say, if your organisation is working purely in the UK, it may not be as much of an issue. But given that we have more diversity in our workforce is because of people coming from different countries, different nationalities all coming together, it can be useful to understand these different national cultures and the different ways of approaching things. But also, if you are working in an international context, then it's useful to have this understanding of how you may interact with and deal with companies in different countries, or even a site within your own organisation is perhaps in another country as well. It can be quite interesting to have this insight. Right, okay, so culture can shape behaviour, because if you have a culture that is a blame culture, for example, employees will not speak up. They'll be frightened to say anything because they don't want to be in the firing line. But if you have a culture that's more open, more embracive of making mistakes and learning from those mistakes and helping people to grow and develop, then the behaviours that you're going to see are going to be different. And likewise, if you have a culture that is focused on sales and meeting targets and competition among the sales force, then you perhaps have behaviours that are much more aggressive, much more assertive. So the behaviours can be shaped by the culture of the organisation. So again, if you have undesirable behaviours within your organisation, you need to look at the culture and think, is the culture actually driving the behaviours? And therefore, do you need to look at changing the culture? So if you want to change behaviours, you maybe need to look at changing the culture of the organisation and identify and decide what are the cultural norms and make sure that they're being reinforced so that the correct behaviours, the behaviours that are going to support the norms that you want, the culture that you're trying to create. You have to make sure that your policies and procedures, for example, are supporting the culture that you desire. And, things like reward, so that you're rewarding the behaviours that are going to create and allow a culture that you're looking for to develop. You want to use your rewards to do that. You want to use your training to make sure that you're training the correct behaviours. And when you're recruiting staff, you're looking at your recruitment policy to make sure that you're going to attract people who are going to share the values that you're developing within your organisation as well. So you want people to fit in. So I talked at the beginning about the fact that culture can add value to an organisation. So if you have decided that the culture you want to create, so you've decided what culture you want within your organisation to help develop a new vision or take forward a new vision for your organisation. If you develop that, manage a change programme so that everybody knows what's expected, everybody knows what you're trying to achieve, and they're all supportive of it and all buying into it. It's going to create a much better environment for the employees to work in. They should be engaging with what the organisation is trying to create. And by doing that, by getting everybody to work together, being supportive, delivering the objectives of the organisation, delivering the mission of the organisation, that then should add value to the organisation. And as I said before, that should add competitive advantage. It should allow the company to operate more effectively in the marketplace. Within an organisation, you can have the corporate culture, which is the culture that senior management want for the organisation. It's the image that they have in their mind as to what the culture should be. The problem is that sometimes that's not quite how it works out. And the experiences of staff and sometimes customers, clients, doesn't actually mirror what the company is trying to achieve. So you can have the corporate culture, which is the stated culture in the mission statement of the organisation. But you can also have subcultures that develop, either because people's experiences don't match the espoused culture, the corporate culture that's being put forward, or different departments or different sites can create their own individual cultures as well. And there are all sorts of different reasons why that can happen, but companies need to be aware when they're thinking about culture, when they're thinking about managing culture, that they will have not just the corporate culture, which is, as I said, their idea of what culture should be, but there may be subcultures that are the dominant culture within a particular area within the organisation, or among a group of people even within a department. So there can be lots of different cultures or different pockets of culture operating within the same organisation at the same time, and management have to be aware of that as well. Right, so as I said, a lot of what we think about when we're thinking about culture is not necessarily just what's currently happening, but a lot of times it can be that the culture is actually damaging or hurting the organisation in some way, and you have to look at changing the culture. But equally, even if the culture is not a problem, if a company is looking at developing a new strategy, going into new markets, sometimes that change in strategy, that change that needs to be managed, can also involve elements of culture. So culture, a lot of change management tends to involve and include aspects of change management. So I just wanted to highlight that overlap to you as well. So hopefully you have found this presentation interesting. Hopefully you have found it helpful, but please, as ever, if you do have any questions, please get in touch. Thank you for listening.